In the narrow streets of West London, where post-war Britain was rebuilding from rubble and scarcity, one man's name became synonymous with greed disguised as opportunity: Peter Rachman. Immigrating from Poland after the Second World War, he started with little more than ambition. He studied the city's housing laws, which were supposed to protect tenants, and found in them 1,000 cracks he could slip through. London was desperate for rooms. Landlords were few, and Rachman realized that control over a single building could mean power not just over walls and roofs, but over lives. He began buying derelict properties in Notting Hill and Paddington, neighborhoods then filled with working-class families and new immigrants from the Caribbean. Where others saw decay, he saw profit. He would buy cheap, evict tenants under legal pretexts, then cram more people into fewer rooms, charging double or triple the rent. His buildings often had leaking ceilings, broken heating, and rotting stairs, but to those without other options, they were the only shelter they could afford. His tactics were a blend of intimidation and bureaucracy. If a tenant refused to leave, he would send men to make their lives unbearable, removing doors, cutting off power, or bringing in disruptive newcomers to encourage them out. Once the old tenants were gone, he filled the same rooms with new arrivals who had no rent protections. Every eviction meant another raise in rent. Every threat meant another week of payment. By the late 1950s, he owned dozens of buildings and controlled hundreds of tenants. Yet Rachman wasn't just a slumlord, he was a showman of his own success. He dressed in tailored suits, drove luxury cars, and hosted glamorous parties where politicians and celebrities mingled with fixers from London's underworld. To some, he represented a rags-to-riches immigrant story. To others, he was the face of a system that turned desperation into gold. His name eventually became shorthand for a new word in the British vocabulary, Rachmanism, meaning ruthless exploitation by landlords. By the early 1960s, public outrage began to swell. Journalists uncovered stories of harassment and corruption in his properties. Tenants spoke out about being terrorized for rent. And while Rachman himself avoided major prison sentences, the shadow of his empire pushed Parliament to reform rental laws and strengthen housing protections. But those laws came too late for many who had already paid their health, dignity, or family peace as rent. Peter Rachman's death in 1962 at just 43 did not end his story. It immortalized it. His name survived as both a warning and a lesson that, when oversight fails, the poor become currency. And decades later, in cities from London to New York, his legacy still echoes in every neglected flat and every tenant who fears the knock at the door not from a stranger, but from their own landlord. By the time Peter Rachman's name became headline news, his empire had already reshaped parts of London beyond recognition. He operated like a general in a quiet war. A war fought not with weapons, but with contracts, loopholes, and fear. Each building he acquired became a fortress of profit. His strategy was simple but ruthless. Push out protected tenants, then bring in new ones with no legal shield. The law allowed it, but morality did not, and the tension would define his downfall. Rachman's tenants were often recent arrivals from the Caribbean, South Asia, or Eastern Europe. Many faced discrimination elsewhere, leaving his buildings their only refuge. He exploited that vulnerability expertly. Reports describe doors being ripped from hinges, pipes left unfixed until ceilings collapsed, and thugs sent to remind tenants of overdue payments. Women were harassed, families evicted at night, and entire homes crammed with bunk beds to squeeze out a few more pounds each week. Still, Rachman didn't see himself as a villain. To his associates, he called it business. He attended charity galas, posed in photographs with politicians, and bragged that he was modernizing London's housing. In private, he boasted that he had found a way to turn slums into gold. His empire became a model that other landlords imitated, some openly, others in secret. And as his profits rose, so did public anger. By the early 1960s, journalists began to dig into rumors about Rachmanism. Tenants started coming forward with their stories. Investigators uncovered patterns of forged leases, illegal rent increases, and violent intimidation. Newspapers printed photos of his dilapidated flats, beside images of his expensive suits and luxury cars, a portrait of inequality made flesh. The scandal reached Parliament, where debates over housing justice echoed his name for years. But before he could face full legal reckoning, Rachman's story ended abruptly. In 1962, he died of a heart attack, leaving behind a tangled network of shell companies and frightened tenants. His empire crumbled, but his legacy lived on in law books and cautionary tales. The government later introduced stricter rent protections and anti-harassment measures directly inspired by his practices. Even now, the phrase Rachmanism stands as a warning proof that unchecked power over shelter can corrupt absolutely. Peter Rachman turned housing into a weapon, using poverty as leverage and desperation as collateral. And while his name faded from the newspapers long ago, his shadow still lingers in every city where profit rises faster than compassion, and where the fear of eviction still feels like the fear of being forgotten. In the heart of Manhattan, where every square foot was worth a fortune, Stephen Croman built his empire one eviction at a time. To some, he was a savvy real estate investor, a man who understood how to turn old rent-controlled buildings into luxury apartments. But to the people who lived in those buildings, he was something else entirely. A landlord who treated human lives like financial obstacles. His story began in the 1990s, when the city was transforming. The crack epidemic had faded, crime rates were falling, and developers saw a new gold rush in the urban core. Croman saw opportunity in rent regulation, an aging policy that capped rent increases for long-term tenants. These tenants paid hundreds less than market rates, and their departure meant instant profit. But instead of waiting for leases to expire, Croman developed ways to make life unbearable enough that they'd leave voluntarily. Tenants reported constant harassment, late-night calls, surprise inspections, relentless repair work that never ended. Some said private investigators followed them, checking whether they truly lived in their apartments full-time. Others described sudden legal threats, forged documents, or fake accusations of subletting. He didn't just want their rent, he wanted them gone. Every eviction cleared space for renovation, and every renovation turned an old, affordable home into a gleaming, high-rent unit for the wealthy. Behind the scenes, Croman financed his operations with an intricate web of loans. Banks loved him, his portfolio was massive, and his income looked impressive. But the truth was that much of that profit came from bending or breaking rules. When the State Attorney General's office launched an investigation, they found patterns of mortgage fraud, tax manipulation, and tenant intimidation that stretched across dozens of buildings. In 2016, it all came crashing down. After years of tenant protests and lawsuits, Croman was arrested and charged with grand larceny, tax fraud, and filing false documents. The prosecution called him the Bernie Madoff of landlords. In court, stories poured out families who'd lived for decades in the same apartments suddenly forced out. Elderly tenants pressured into leaving. Single mothers paying rent while living under constant threat of losing their homes. He eventually pled guilty and served time in prison, though his real punishment came from public exposure. The once powerful property mogul was now a symbol of everything wrong with New York's housing system. How profit-driven landlords could exploit weak regulation and endless demand to turn housing into cruelty. Even after his release, the echoes of his reign remained. Some of his buildings were sold, others stayed under new management. But the scars lingered among tenants who had endured his tactics. For them, Stephen Croman wasn't just a name. He was a reminder that in a city obsessed with success, the line between ambition and abuse could vanish behind a lease agreement and a polished smile. The arrest of Stephen Croman was more than the downfall of a single landlord. It was the unmasking of a culture that treated tenants like stepping stones to luxury. His rise mirrored New York City's gentrification itself. Polished on the surface, brutal underneath. He started as a small-time property buyer in Manhattan's East Village, but within a decade, he owned more than 100 buildings across the city. Each one became part of his empire, and each tenant inside became a target. When investigators later combed through his records, they discovered an empire built on deceit. Croman allegedly used forged loan applications to secure millions in financing, inflating his rental income and property values to impress banks. Behind the numbers, the reality was uglier. Aging tenants, broken elevators, and constant fear. Long-term residents under rent regulation found themselves at the center of an invisible war. His staff and private investigators harassed them with endless paperwork, fake eviction notices, and intrusive inspections. Some even described being told, "You can't afford to live here anymore." Tenants organized. They documented broken locks, mold, and deliberate construction noise, the kind meant not to improve but to torment. Lawsuits followed, and their stories began appearing in local newspapers. For years, it seemed nothing could stop him. His wealth insulated him, and his lawyers delayed every case. But by the mid-2010s, the pressure reached a breaking point. In 2016, the New York Attorney General's office indicted him on 17 felony counts, including fraud and grand larceny. Prosecutors said he used false documents to secure bank loans, claiming higher income than his buildings actually generated. He was also accused of running a tenant relocation scheme, legal jargon for pushing people out by any means possible. The courtroom heard testimony from tenants who had lived under him for decades, their voices trembling as they described sleepless nights, constant threats, and the feeling of being hunted inside their own homes. When Croman pleaded guilty in 2017, it was hailed as a victory for tenants across the city. He was sentenced to prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution. Yet, for many, justice felt incomplete. He served a short term compared to the years of suffering he caused, and his company continued to operate under new management. But symbolically, his conviction cracked the illusion that powerful landlords were untouchable. Stephen Croman's empire was not just about real estate, it was about control. He turned the housing system into a machine that rewarded cruelty and punished vulnerability. His story became a rallying cry for reformers, demanding stronger tenant protections, rent laws, and corporate accountability. In the end, his name joined the long list of landlords whose greed transformed homes into battlegrounds. And for every family that once lived in fear of his letters and knock on the door, his fall offered a reminder that power, no matter how high it climbs, can still be brought back down to street level. Nicholas van Hoogstraten was not the kind of landlord who feared bad press. He seemed to invite it. Arrogant, sharp-tongued, and openly disdainful of anyone who stood in his way, he built one of Britain's most notorious reputations in property, part tycoon, part menace. Born into modest means, he began his career as a teenage loan shark, intimidating borrowers and snatching up properties from those who couldn't pay. By his 20s, he was already wealthy and feared. By his 30s, he was being called Britain's most hated landlord. His empire thrived in the chaos of post-war housing demand. Old Victorian flats in Brighton and London became his hunting ground. He bought cheaply, rented aggressively, and when tenants resisted his terms, he made their lives unbearable. Court records and testimonies described tactics that bordered on warfare, smashed doors, unlivable conditions, and threats disguised as business correspondence. He once bragged to a journalist that he didn't rent to scum, then spent years evicting those too poor or proud to leave on their own. But Hoogstraten's story wasn't just about property, it was about power. He flaunted it, from his collection of art and luxury cars to his infamous mansion, Hamilton Palace, a gargantuan estate so vast it became a symbol of greed itself. He wore his controversies like medals, often mocking reporters and calling judges idiots. When rival landlords or tenants took him to court, he countersued with fury. In one chilling case, a business associate who sued him was found murdered, leading to years of legal drama linking Hoogstraten to violent enforcers and criminal associates. Despite prison sentences, one for sending armed men to intimidate an opponent, he always returned to business. Each scandal only seemed to increase his notoriety. Even in his later years, after declaring bankruptcy and losing parts of his empire, he continued collecting rent through complex ownership networks, insisting he had done nothing wrong. To his defenders, he was a self-made man who refused to play by anyone's rules. To his critics, he was a relic of the worst kind of capitalism, where money justified cruelty and fear was just another business expense. British housing advocates used his name as shorthand for unchecked landlord power, and politicians cited him when pushing for reforms. He never apologized, never softened. In interviews, he would smirk and say the poor deserved what they got. That defiance made him infamous, a caricature of greed made real. His buildings still stand, and so does the unfinished Hamilton Palace, now an eerie monument to arrogance and decay. Nicholas van Hoogstraten didn't just own property. He owned the narrative of exploitation itself. The belief that control over shelter could make someone untouchable. And in the long history of Britain's landlords, no one wielded that control with such open contempt for the people beneath his roofs. Lakireddy Bali Reddy was a landlord who wore two faces, one of success and respectability, and another of cruelty and exploitation. To his community in Berkeley, California, he was a generous immigrant success story, a millionaire developer who built apartments, donated to local causes, and funded scholarships for Indian students. But beneath that polished image was a dark system of trafficking, coercion, and abuse, one that turned his real estate holdings into sites of suffering. Reddy arrived in the United States from India in the 1960s, part of a generation chasing opportunity. Over the decades, he built a real estate empire worth millions. His properties dotted the streets of Berkeley apartments, filled mostly with low-income tenants, including many from India. He presented himself as a benefactor, helping newly arrived families find housing and jobs. But that trust became the weapon he used to trap them. Behind closed doors, prosecutors later discovered a horrifying pattern. Reddy and his associates brought young women from India to America under false pretenses, often claiming they were relatives or domestic workers. Once here, they were kept under his control, some forced into servitude, others subjected to sexual exploitation. Apartments that tenants thought were homes turned out to be prisons for the powerless. The truth surfaced only after tragedy. In the year 2000, a young woman died of carbon monoxide poisoning in one of his buildings. When investigators examined the case, they uncovered inconsistencies in the girl's immigration papers and noticed Reddy's name connected to multiple visa sponsorships. The deeper they dug, the more shocking the story became. He had been using his status as a respected landlord to traffic people, using apartments as cover for crimes that had gone unnoticed for years. When federal agents moved in, they found falsified documents, fraudulent visa applications, and victims too afraid to speak. In court, testimony revealed that Reddy controlled every part of their lives, their shelter, their income, even their silence. The prosecution described it as a hidden system of modern slavery operating in plain sight, protected by wealth, status, and the illusion of philanthropy. Reddy eventually pleaded guilty to charges including human trafficking, immigration fraud, and exploitation. He was sentenced to federal prison, fined heavily, and ordered to pay restitution to his victims. His sons and business associates were also implicated, showing how deep the operation ran through his family and corporate networks. The case stunned Berkeley, a city that prided itself on progress and justice. How could such cruelty thrive in its midst, undetected for so long? For years, his buildings had symbolized stability for immigrants. Now, they symbolized betrayal. Even after his release, the name Lakireddy Bali Reddy remained synonymous with corruption of power, a reminder that greed is not always about money. Sometimes, it's about control. He used real estate not as a means to build a life, but as a tool to destroy others. His empire still stands in part, but the story of what happened inside its walls lingers as one of the darkest chapters in American landlord history. When the story of Lakireddy Bali Reddy broke, it sounded like fiction. A man who built an empire of apartments and restaurants in California, hiding a human trafficking network behind its walls. But it wasn't fiction. It was a meticulously sustained system of exploitation operating right in Berkeley, one of America's most progressive cities. To his tenants and business peers, Reddy was a success story, an immigrant who rose from rural India to American wealth. He employed hundreds, owned vast real estate holdings, and even funded scholarships for Indian students. But the same connections he used to uplift his image were the ones he used to traffic young women into the country. He recruited victims from his hometown in Andhra Pradesh, India, promising their families education and opportunity abroad. In reality, the girls were brought to the U.S. under falsified documents, forced to work in his businesses, and sexually exploited. Apartments that symbolized stability for the community became silent prisons for those trapped inside. The truth began to surface in late 1999, after a young girl died from carbon monoxide poisoning in one of Reddy's buildings. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in immigration papers connected to the victim and discovered that her visa had been arranged through Reddy's company. The deeper they looked, the more disturbing the evidence became. Fraudulent visas, hidden payments, and testimonies from survivors who described years of fear and manipulation. Federal prosecutors accused him of using his landlord status as cover, moving victims between properties to avoid detection. He controlled every part of their existence, their homes, their work, their documentation, and even their voices. Those who tried to leave were threatened with deportation or public shame. In 2001, Reddy pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, including human trafficking, immigration fraud, and exploitation. The plea deal spared his victims from the trauma of testifying in full trials, but their written statements painted a chilling portrait of calculated domination. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and fined heavily, while his family and associates faced related charges. The case sent shockwaves through California. How could such a network flourish undetected in a city known for activism and oversight? The answer was uncomfortable wealth and reputation had built a wall thicker than any lock. He was seen as a community figure, not a criminal. That perception protected him for years. Even after his release, the Lakireddy name remained a symbol of hypocrisy, philanthropy, masking, predation. His properties were sold, renamed, but the scars lingered. The federal case against him helped push reforms in immigration enforcement and trafficking awareness, forcing both housing and law enforcement agencies to rethink how power can be abused within systems meant to protect. Lakireddy Bali Reddy's empire was a reflection of two worlds colliding, the dream of opportunity and the nightmare of exploitation. He owned homes, restaurants, and respect, yet his legacy is built not on what he created, but on the lives he destroyed while pretending to offer them shelter. When federal agents entered the apartments owned by Lakireddy Bali Reddy, they weren't just investigating a landlord, they were uncovering an empire that used real estate as camouflage for one of the most disturbing trafficking cases in modern American history. What looked like an immigrant success story, an Indian-born landlord turned multi-millionaire in California, was built on human exploitation, deceit, and control. For years, Reddy's name carried weight in Berkeley. He owned dozens of apartment buildings, ran restaurants, and sponsored educational programs. Immigrant families looked up to him. Many from his hometown in India saw him as proof that hard work could lead to wealth abroad. But the reality beneath that image was horrifying. Reddy wasn't just renting homes, he was importing victims. He brought young girls from India under false pretenses, promising schooling and jobs, but instead trapping them in servitude and abuse. The scheme operated quietly. Victims were hidden among tenants, moved between properties, and kept isolated. They had no freedom, no pay, and no way out. Reddy's power came not only from his wealth, but from fear. Fear of deportation, exposure, or retaliation. Even local officials and neighbors didn't question his activities. After all, he seemed generous, polished, and successful. That facade kept the truth buried for decades. It all began to unravel after an accidental death in one of his properties, a teenage girl poisoned by carbon monoxide from a faulty heater. Her death should have been just another tragic accident, but it exposed a web of lies. Investigators tracing her background found forged immigration papers, false sponsorship claims, and connections leading straight to Reddy's real estate network. What they uncovered was a transnational operation of human trafficking, disguised as housing management. In 2001, federal prosecutors charged him with immigration fraud, money laundering, and trafficking. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, testimony from survivors, and financial records showing how exploitation funded his business. He eventually pleaded guilty and received an 8-year federal sentence. His family and associates were also implicated, confirming that the empire wasn't built alone. The aftermath was a moral reckoning for Berkeley. How could such crimes exist in plain sight, under the watch of one of its wealthiest landlords? The case forced the community and the country to confront how power shields exploitation. Reddy's conviction led to new discussions about housing oversight, immigrant vulnerability, and the blind spots of privilege. When he left prison, Reddy's empire was dismantled, but the shadow it cast remained. His name became shorthand for corruption hidden beneath philanthropy, a man who turned the promise of shelter into an instrument of suffering. For his victims, the apartments he owned were never homes. They were cages disguised as opportunity. The story of Lakireddy Bali Reddy is a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always wear the mask of violence. Sometimes it wears a suit, owns property, and calls itself success until the walls themselves start to speak. In the heart of Manhattan's Washington Heights stood a string of apartment buildings whose hallways told a story of decay, collapsing ceilings, mold-covered walls, broken heating systems, and silence from the man who owned them. That man was Daniel Ohebshalom, a landlord whose name became synonymous with neglect, fraud, and cruelty hidden behind corporate paperwork and high-rise profits. For years, tenants pleaded for repairs. Winters passed without heat. Summers brought infestations, and complaints piled up faster than the city could process them. What outsiders saw as standard wear and tear was, to the residents, deliberate abandonment. Ohebshalom's buildings weren't just neglected, they were weaponized. By letting them rot, he created conditions so unbearable that long-time tenants would eventually move out. Each vacancy opened the door for higher rents and bigger profits. The tactics were subtle but ruthless. Leaks that could have been fixed in hours were ignored for months. Pest infestations spread through entire floors. Tenants who organized were met with intimidation or sudden inspections meant to unsettle them. And behind the scenes, shell companies shifted ownership between one another, shielding Ohebshalom from accountability. City inspectors documented hundreds of violations, from fire code breaches to life-threatening structural hazards. Yet the fines, even when issued, barely made a dent in his profits. For a man whose real estate empire stretched across multiple boroughs, neglect wasn't negligence, it was strategy. By the early 2020s, his name appeared near the top of the city's worst landlords list. Advocacy groups began protesting outside his properties, holding up photographs of collapsed ceilings and mold-damaged children's bedrooms. When the media caught wind, the pressure finally broke through the layers of corporate defense that had long protected him. Authorities moved in with criminal charges that painted a picture of systemic exploitation. Prosecutors accused Ohebshalom of falsifying building records, harassing tenants, and maintaining unsafe living conditions as a form of coercion. What made his case stand out wasn't just the neglect, it was the intent. These weren't accidents or oversights. They were deliberate business decisions calculated to maximize returns while minimizing empathy. For the tenants still trapped inside his properties, justice was bittersweet. The arrest brought vindication, but not repair. Many buildings remained in disrepair, and the damage, emotional and physical, couldn't be undone. Yet, for the first time, the city was forced to confront a reality it had ignored for decades. Some landlords build their wealth not through construction, but through destruction. The case of Daniel Ohebshalom became more than an indictment. It became a symbol. It showed how unchecked power in housing can turn the most basic human need, shelter, into an instrument of control. In the end, his legacy wasn't the fortune he amassed, but the fear he instilled, proof that greed can hollow out a home long before the walls start to crumble. In Brooklyn's tight-knit real estate circles, Menachem Stark was both admired and despised, a man whose rise from small-time landlord to multi-million-dollar developer came with equal measures of ambition and controversy. His story was one of unchecked expansion, mounting violations, and the illusion of prosperity built atop tenant suffering. But it would end not in court, but on a frozen January night that exposed how deeply money and morality can clash in the world of property power. For years, Stark's empire grew quietly. He owned dozens of buildings across Williamsburg and beyond, many of them older rent-controlled properties acquired during the borough's transformation from working-class neighborhood to gentrification hub. His strategy was simple: buy cheap, renovate selectively, and raise rents wherever possible. But behind the facade of progress lay a darker reality. Tenants reported neglect, harassment, and unsafe living conditions, elevators that never worked, heating failures in the dead of winter, and aggressive attempts to push families out of regulated apartments. City inspectors had him on file for dozens of violations. Critics accused him of exploiting loopholes in housing law, manipulating paperwork, and using shell companies to obscure responsibility. Yet, for all the noise, Stark remained untouchable. He donated generously to local causes, maintained close ties within his religious community, and projected the image of a successful, charitable family man. His world operated on contradiction: philanthropy by day, profit through pressure by night. But by the early 2010s, cracks began to appear. Lawsuits piled up from tenants and contractors alike. Former business partners accused him of defaulting on loans and pocketing funds meant for maintenance. Banks tightened their grip, and whispers circulated that Stark's empire was built on leverage he could no longer control. Then, on a bitter January evening, Stark vanished. Security footage captured the last moments of him leaving his office, followed by a struggle near his minivan. The next day, his body was found miles away, bound, burned, and buried in snow. The shocking discovery sent waves through New York, not only for its brutality, but for what it revealed about the hidden rot behind the city's glittering development boom. Police eventually arrested a group of men linked to a botched kidnapping motivated by unpaid debts, a grim testament to how Stark's financial dealings had blurred the lines between business and desperation. Yet, even in death, his name stirred fierce debate. To some, he was a victim of greed turned against itself. To others, he was the architect of his own downfall, a man who built wealth on human suffering and called it success. What followed was a moral autopsy of New York's housing industry. Tenants spoke out about the fear of retaliation, the manipulation of rent laws, and how landlords like Stark thrived by turning homes into commodities. Reporters traced the same pattern seen in countless other cases: profit before safety, intimidation before accountability. Menachem Stark's story doesn't fit neatly into hero or villain. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition devours empathy, when housing becomes a weapon, and when the pursuit of profit crosses into predation. His death exposed not just one man's sins, but a system that rewards exploitation until it consumes its own. In the end, the empire he built on borrowed trust collapsed, leaving behind a legacy measured not in buildings or wealth, but in the cold silence of the tenants who outlived him. Long before his name appeared in headlines, Menachem Stark had already become a symbol of contradiction in Brooklyn's booming real estate world. To some, he was the picture of success, a self-made developer who poured money into community projects and built sleek residential towers across Williamsburg. To others, he was a ruthless landlord whose neglect and intimidation turned the city's housing shortage into personal profit. His rise was fueled by timing. As Williamsburg transformed from an industrial landscape into one of New York's hottest real estate zones, Stark seized every opportunity. He bought old buildings at rock-bottom prices, financed new projects with aggressive loans, and courted investors who trusted his boldness. Tenants, however, described a different world: broken locks, withheld heat, harassment for refusing to vacate rent-stabilized units. Complaints mounted while renovations continued on the floors above them, filling hallways with dust and danger. City housing records eventually listed dozens of open violations across Stark's portfolio, but fines were treated as costs of doing business. He shifted ownership between shell companies, making accountability nearly impossible. The wealth that surrounded him insulated his empire. Even when lawsuits surfaced, they ended quietly, buried beneath settlements and sealed court documents. By 2014, Stark's debts were mounting, his reputation darkening. Contractors claimed unpaid invoices. Lenders accused him of falsified valuations. Tenants were filing civil complaints faster than his lawyers could respond. Behind the glossy facade of philanthropy, the donations, the sponsorships, the lavish community events, cracks had begun to spread. Then came the night of January 2014. Security footage captured Stark leaving his office, stepping into the freezing air, and being forced into a waiting van. Hours later, his body was found in a Long Island dumpster, bound and burned. The news sent shockwaves through the city. Within days, every newspaper carried his face. Who would dare abduct and kill a millionaire developer in the middle of a blizzard? The investigation that followed peeled back years of financial chaos and silent enemies. Detectives uncovered a tangled web of failed partnerships, outstanding debts, and accusations of predatory lending. Ultimately, prosecutors concluded that the kidnapping had been a botched attempt at debt collection. Not a professional hit, but a desperate act born from the same greed and mistrust that had defined Stark's business. Several men were convicted, but the questions surrounding his empire and his methods never fully faded. The public reaction was divided. His community mourned deeply, viewing him as a generous man taken too soon. But many tenants and critics felt that his death symbolized a larger reckoning, a moment when unchecked power in property met its inevitable consequence. In their eyes, the violence that ended his life was an echo of the violence he inflicted economically. Eviction, neglect, and despair disguised as redevelopment. Menachem Stark's story remains one of the most haunting chapters in New York's real estate history. It exposed a truth the city often avoids, that behind every gleaming new tower lies a shadow of displacement, and behind some fortunes, a trail of ruin. His death closed a single case, but opened a larger question. When profit becomes obsession, does the system itself turn predatory? In the cold winter that claimed his life, that question lingered like steam rising from the streets, uncomfortably close and impossible to ignore. The days following Menachem Stark's death became a collision between grief, outrage, and revelation. As reporters pieced together his final hours, tenants and investigators began to unravel the deeper truth about how he had run his real estate empire. An empire that thrived on chaos. In life, Stark had built a reputation as a man who could turn derelict properties into profit. His business model relied on aggressive borrowing and fast renovations, financed through short-term, high-interest loans. It made him millions, but it also trapped him in a cycle of debt. When loans came due, he refinanced or leveraged new properties to pay off old ones. It was a house of cards disguised as success. And as his empire grew, so did the number of people he owed. Contractors, partners, and lenders all wanted their share. Meanwhile, the buildings themselves were falling apart. Tenants complained of leaking roofs, unreliable elevators, and intimidation tactics used to drive out families under rent control. Yet Stark seemed untouchable, shielded by layers of limited liability companies and a network of business allies. Even when city inspectors fined him for violations, he treated the penalties as routine, the cost of doing business in New York's cutthroat property game. Behind the glossy facade, cracks had begun to spread. Court filings showed years of disputes with financial institutions and private investors. When banks stopped extending credit, Stark turned to less traditional lenders, a world where handshakes replaced contracts and threats replaced lawyers. In that gray zone between ambition and desperation, he crossed paths with men who saw him not as a businessman, but as a target. The night he disappeared, investigators believe Stark thought he was heading to a meeting to settle one of those debts. Instead, he was forced into a van and never came back. The brutality of his murder made headlines across the country. Yet, as shocking as the crime was, the revelations that followed were equally unsettling. The debt, the lawsuits, the trail of broken promises and betrayed trust that stretched through every corner of his empire. His death forced a reckoning within the real estate community. It exposed how profit-driven landlords operated in the shadows, using loopholes and intimidation to amass fortunes while tenants suffered. For many New Yorkers, Stark's downfall symbolized the moral collapse of an industry where greed had become normal. The same system that allowed him to thrive also allowed him to fall unchecked, unaccountable, and ultimately undone by the very power he wielded. In the years since, Stark's name has come to represent more than one man's crime or misfortune. It embodies the dangerous intersection of ambition and apathy, where human lives become collateral in the pursuit of wealth. His story remains a grim reminder that the cost of ignoring corruption isn't measured only in money, but in the erosion of trust itself. Menachem Stark's legacy was meant to be buildings and profits. What he left instead was a warning carved into the skyline of the city he helped shape. When success demands silence, it breeds its own destruction. San Francisco's South of Market neighborhood was once filled with rent-controlled buildings that served as lifelines for working families and retirees. To landlords chasing profit, those same buildings were obstacles-locked investments that could not be flipped until tenants were gone. For Kip and Nicole Macy, that obstacle became a challenge they were willing to destroy lives to overcome. They owned a building on 23rd Street that, on paper, was ordinary. Aging units, long-term tenants, modest rent. But beneath that paper trail lay a campaign of terror meant to clear it out. When polite requests for tenants to leave failed, the Macys switched to psychological warfare. Tenants began finding their mail tampered with, rent checks lost, locks glued shut, and eviction notices pinned to their doors without court orders. Soon the harassment escalated. Residents described nights when power suddenly went out across their units. Refrigerators stopped humming, and the temperature plummeted. The couple allegedly cut utility lines, leaving families in darkness. They poured ammonia through mail slots to make apartments unlivable. When that failed to drive tenants away, they went further, entering occupied units without permission, removing belongings, and in one case, soaring through a supporting beam beneath a tenant's floor to make the structure unstable. It would have been easy to dismiss the accounts as exaggeration if they hadn't been corroborated by photographs, audio recordings, and surveillance video. The pattern was unmistakable. Tenants who resisted were targeted with relentless intimidation until they fled. Each vacancy allowed the Macy's to renovate the unit, remove rent control, and relist it at market rates. In a city where a one-bedroom could triple in price overnight, cruelty became a business plan. By 2008, investigators had enough evidence to bring felony charges, including stalking, vandalism, burglary, and conspiracy. But before the trial, the Mackes fled the country, vanishing to Central America. For years, the case lingered as a dark urban legend among tenant rights groups. Then, nearly half a decade later, they were tracked down, extradited, and brought back to face justice. In court, prosecutors laid out every act of harassment as part of a coordinated scheme. The defense argued that they were simply protecting their property, but jurors saw the truth. This wasn't management. It was calculated terror against people with no power to fight back. Both pled guilty and were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Their downfall reverberated far beyond San Francisco. For tenants across the country, it became a rallying cry against predatory landlords who weaponized neglect and intimidation. For city officials, it forced a re-examination of how easy it was for property owners to abuse legal loopholes under the guise of renovation. The name Macy now sits among the most infamous in modern landlord history. A reminder that greed doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it hides behind a property deed and a smile, waiting for darkness to fall before cutting the power. Their story became proof that even in one of America's richest cities, people could be made to live in fear inside the very homes that were supposed to protect them. When prosecutors finally revealed the full scope of what Kip and Nicole Macy had done, even seasoned investigators were stunned. Their campaign of terror inside a rent-controlled building wasn't just about money. It was about control, about breaking people psychologically so they would leave without a fight. The Mackes had bought their San Francisco property during a housing boom, when every unit flipped at market value could mean a windfall. But the families living there were paying low, regulated rents. To the Macy's, those tenants represented lost income, so they decided to make their lives unlivable. What followed sounded like a plot from a crime film, but it was real, and it happened in the heart of one of America's most expensive cities. They cut heat and water during winter, shut off electricity without warning, and broke windows to expose apartments to cold and rain. When tenants called repair crews, the Mackes would fire them or cancel maintenance orders. At night, strange noises echoed through the walls, power tools, banging pipes, slamming doors, all meant to intimidate. In one chilling instance, a tenant found his belongings dumped in the hallway, his locks changed while he was at work. The message was clear: leave, or things would get worse. Tenants complained to city authorities, but enforcement was slow. The Mackes' lawyers buried inspectors in paperwork, arguing over technicalities while the harassment continued. One tenant later told investigators that he would sleep in shifts, terrified the couple would break in. Another said ammonia was poured into her unit's vents, making it impossible to breathe. Their cruelty wasn't impulsive, it was systematic. Each vacancy brought an opportunity to remodel and relist at 3 or 4 times the old rent. They tracked each eviction like a business milestone, celebrating when another long-term tenant gave up. For years, they got away with it, confident that the law moved too slowly to stop them. But victims documented everything: photos of damage, recordings of threats, and witness statements that painted a clear pattern of abuse. When prosecutors finally brought charges, they uncovered evidence that the Macy's had conspired to defraud tenants, tamper with utilities, and even break into apartments while residents were away. Before the case could go to trial, the couple fled to Central America, leaving behind a trail of lawsuits, debt, and fear. Their capture years later closed one of San Francisco's darkest housing chapters. In court, both pled guilty to multiple felonies, their empire of intimidation dismantled piece by piece. For tenant advocates, the convictions symbolized a turning point, proof that even the wealthy could face justice for weaponizing property against the powerless. The case reshaped local housing oversight and inspired calls for stronger tenant protections. Yet, the scars remained. Many of their victims never returned to the neighborhood. Others said they still checked their doors twice before sleeping. The Maquis had treated their building not as homes, but as obstacles, and in doing so, turned real estate into psychological warfare. Their story remains a warning carved into San Francisco's history. When greed overrides humanity, even a home the place meant to protect can become a battlefield. Across major American cities, a new breed of landlord emerged, not a single face, but a system. Corporate ownership replaced the old image of a local property manager. Thousands of apartments, owned by shell companies, managed by subsidiaries, all feeding profits into investment funds. On the surface, it looked efficient. In reality, it became one of the most exploitative housing models in modern history. It started quietly, after the housing crash of 2008. When families lost their homes, investment firms bought entire neighborhoods at foreclosure auctions. At first, it was sold as a way to stabilize communities. But within a few years, those same firms transformed into mega landlords. They raised rents, slashed maintenance budgets, and turned low-income housing into high-yield assets. Tenants weren't people anymore. They were units of revenue. Inspections revealed horrifying conditions. Mold climbing up bathroom walls. Heating systems broken for months. Rodents nesting in vents. In some cases, sewage leaks went unrepaired for weeks because managers were told to defer costs. The violations numbered in the thousands, a pattern of neglect that turned profit by reducing expenses, even if it meant tenants living in danger. Residents tried to fight back, but the landlords were faceless. The person they called for repairs didn't own the property. The company on the lease didn't exist outside of a post office box. And behind it all was a chain of private equity firms, investors, and trusts, each layer built to insulate accountability. Cities like Atlanta, Phoenix, and Los Angeles became ground zero for the new housing crisis. Corporate landlords bought up affordable units, rebranded them as renovated luxury apartments, and forced existing tenants to leave through non-renewals or sudden maintenance shutdowns. In New York, tenants described a new wave of paper evictions, where legal loopholes replaced intimidation. The cruelty was no longer personal, it was automated. By the early 2020s, public outrage reached Congress. Investigations revealed how some of the biggest rental corporations had been fined millions for health violations while still receiving government-backed financing. In one case, a company with over 70,000 apartments was cited for more than 2,000 code violations, leaking roofs, broken alarms, toxic mold, yet continued to post record profits. Whistleblowers later described internal spreadsheets that ranked properties not by safety or livability, but by profit potential after eviction. When one building's maintenance costs rose, tenants were relocated not for repairs, but to make way for rent increases. Every act of neglect had been planned. Every delay in fixing a heater was a line item in an accounting sheet. The modern slumlord empire wasn't born from one villain. It was engineered through policy, loopholes, and the cold efficiency of capitalism. When housing became an investment instead of a necessity, cruelty turned into a business strategy. Today, reformers call it corporate Rachmanism, a new name for an old evil. The faces have changed, the tactics modernized, but the victims remain the same. Families, elders, and workers trapped between rising rent and falling ceilings. In cities across America, their cries echo through luxury-branded hallways, reminders that when shelter becomes profit, humanity is the first thing evicted. In cities from Melbourne to Amsterdam, from Toronto to Berlin, student housing has become one of the world's most profitable and predatory real estate sectors. The model looks benevolent on paper. Sleek high-rises, marketed as safe, community-driven apartments for international students. But behind the modern facades and glossy brochures, many of these global housing operators run empires of overcrowding, exploitation, and neglect, all under the guise of education. It began when private equity discovered that universities, facing space shortages, were desperate for off-campus housing. Firms saw opportunity, not duty. They bought aging dorms, built compact micro-apartments, and began charging rents far above what students could afford. The contracts were airtight, non-refundable deposits, hidden service fees, and strict clauses that fined tenants for nearly anything from late rent to minor wall marks. The promise of independence for young people far from home became a trap signed in ink. In London, students shared stories of paying luxury-level prices for rooms smaller than storage closets. In Paris and Madrid, residents reported mold, broken heating, and fire alarms that failed for weeks at a time. Complaints went unanswered. Maintenance requests disappeared into automated systems that sent polite replies but no repairs. In some cases, students were forced to share kitchens and bathrooms with twice the number of people the building was licensed for. Cost optimization, the companies called it. When tenants organized, the landlords retaliated through bureaucracy. Notices of lease violations arrived without explanation. Security deposits vanished behind opaque accounting. In Australia, a wave of protests erupted after international students found themselves locked into leases even after moving out. Still billed thousands for rooms they no longer occupied. Legal protections were almost non-existent, as most housing fell into grey zones between university oversight and private sector regulation. Investigations across multiple countries began revealing the same pattern. One corporation behind dozens of local subsidiaries, shifting ownership whenever scrutiny grew. It wasn't just negligence, it was designed exploitation. Students were ideal tenants, transient, isolated, often foreign, and unfamiliar with local law. They complained less and paid more. In 2021, leaked internal documents from one major firm exposed how managers calculated expected tolerance rates, estimating how long tenants would endure poor conditions before leaving. The data showed profit increased when maintenance costs stayed below a fixed ratio per occupant, even if that meant ignoring dangerous infrastructure issues. Their business model depended on suffering being temporary and silent. Governments have since launched inquiries, but enforcement lags behind. The same companies still advertise on university websites, still sell safety and community as marketing slogans. Meanwhile, students continue to crowd into overpriced, deteriorating rooms, paying the price of education, not in tuition, but in dignity. What makes this scandal uniquely disturbing isn't just the greed, it's who it preys upon. The young, the hopeful, those taking their first steps toward independence. Their trust, like their rent, became a resource to be mined. And as these corporate landlords expand globally, the story repeats across continents. Promises of comfort, masking systems of quiet exploitation. In the end, the global student housing empire represents a new kind of cruelty, one that doesn't shout, but whispers through broken pipes and hidden fees. A generation expected to learn about the world, instead learned its harshest lesson, that even a home built for students can become a classroom in corruption. It was marketed as a masterpiece of modern living, a skyscraper of glass and light, a place where comfort met class. Residents paid thousands each month for views of the skyline, concierge service, and the illusion of perfection. But behind the marble lobbies and polished advertisements, the truth began to leak literally. Water seeped through the penthouse ceilings. Elevators stalled between floors for hours. Tenants filed complaint after complaint about broken HVAC systems, rodent infestations, and unaddressed mold spreading behind designer walls. The management company promised swift action, yet weeks turned into months. Repairs came only when inspections loomed. Those who pressed too hard found renewal, notices mysteriously denied, or rent raised overnight retaliation disguised as procedure. The tower had been built not as a home, but as an investment vehicle. Its units were quietly owned by shell corporations and foreign trusts. For developers, luxury was a marketing word, not a standard of living. Corners were cut in construction, materials swapped for cheaper alternatives, and safety inspections delayed until after occupancy permits were rushed through. What looked like elegance was simply debt dressed in stone and glass. Tenants began to document everything: burst pipes, collapsing ceilings, and vermin crawling across imported tile. Some even banded together to hire private inspectors, who discovered extensive violations hidden behind cosmetic renovations. Their findings shocked even seasoned engineers. Faulty wiring, unsafe fire exits, and structural shortcuts that violated multiple codes. These weren't isolated errors, they were systemic choices made in the pursuit of profit. When city authorities finally intervened, fines were issued, but little changed. The company simply restructured under a new name and continued operating the same buildings. Wealth insulated accountability. Each new LLC acted as a shield. Lawsuits piled up, but payouts were tiny compared to rent income. Residents realized that even in luxury towers, justice was a privilege they couldn't afford. The cruel irony was unmistakable. The same tenants who paid for exclusivity were living in fear of the next blackout or water leak. Their voices were muffled by non-disclosure clauses and legal intimidation. "It's not just slumlords in poor neighborhoods anymore," one resident said. "It's slumlords in suits." Media coverage briefly ignited outrage, but attention faded as quickly as it came. The developer continued to build elsewhere, selling new ultra-luxury projects to the next wave of hopeful buyers. The tower still stands, its mirrored glass reflecting the city beautiful from a distance, rotting from within. The scandal revealed a deeper truth about modern real estate. Neglect isn't confined to poverty. It thrives wherever accountability dies. The poor suffer in silence, and the rich suffer in disbelief, but the cause is the same. When housing becomes speculation, care disappears. Residents had paid for serenity, but lived inside a quiet collapse. Behind the champagne receptions and designer mailrooms, their complaints echoed like ghosts through the vents. What they learned, what every city now confronts, is that luxury doesn't protect you from exploitation. It just hides it under better lighting. Across centuries and continents, the story of housing has always been a reflection of power. A roof is supposed to mean safety. A locked door is supposed to mean peace, yet for millions, those promises were turned against them. What began as a simple exchange rent for shelter evolved into one of humanity's most profitable forms of cruelty. The landlord became not a caretaker, but a gatekeeper. One who could decide, with a signature or a silence, who gets to live with dignity and who doesn't. The most disturbing truth that emerged from every case, from the slum tenements of 19th century London to the luxury towers of modern New York, is that exploitation doesn't discriminate by class. The poor endure the visible violence of neglect, and the rich suffer under the invisible weight of deceit. Whether in broken public housing or million-dollar condos, the abuse of power follows the same script. Profit over people, image over safety, possession over humanity. For tenants, the home became both refuge and battlefield. Eviction notices replaced conversation. Repairs became bargaining chips. Each complaint was met with intimidation or indifference. The system was designed not to fail, but to function this way, a machinery that rewards landlords who cut corners and punishes tenants who speak up. Law was meant to protect the vulnerable, but in many cities, it became an accomplice. Complex ownership webs and corporate shells blurred accountability. Regulators, often understaffed or politically tied, acted too late or not at all. And every fine, every temporary injunction, was absorbed as a cost of doing business cheaper than compassion. The psychological cost of living under such control is harder to measure. Families learn to stop asking for help. Children grow up thinking cold winters and leaking ceilings are normal. Even those who escape carry the quiet trauma of instability, the knowledge that home can vanish at the whim of a stranger. In that way, housing abuse doesn't just break buildings, it breaks trust. The global housing crisis has exposed how deeply the moral meaning of shelter has eroded. Governments auctioned public homes to private investors. Corporations rebranded exploitation as market adjustment. Media glorified landlords as visionaries and tenants as burdens. The very language of home ownership, property portfolio, asset class, rental yield, stripped humanity from the equation. But history also shows resistance. Whistleblowers who leaked ledgers, tenants who organized, filmed, and documented the truth. Lawyers who built cases brick by brick. In cities from Dublin to Detroit, from Mumbai to Madrid, they reminded the world that shelter is not a privilege to be purchased. It is a right to be defended. When shelter became a weapon, as one housing activist said, our humanity was the first casualty, yet awareness is the first repair. Every expose, every protest, every documentary that reveals the hidden rot beneath glossy towers pushes the conversation toward accountability. The fight isn't just about roofs and walls, it's about restoring the idea that homes should heal, not harm. And so this chronicle ends where it began, at the threshold, the place between safety and fear, between profit and morality, between ownership and oppression. Because in the end, the measure of any society isn't how high it builds its towers, but how it treats the people living beneath them.